Hey guys, this video is for the sophomores. Remember to watch these videos from start to finish. It's really important, especially this video, because we're going to be talking about an important topic today, and that's the Mexican War. Now, we've been talking for the past few classes about manifest destiny, right? There was a whole dream that the United States would expand, right? Expand from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. And when President Polk was elected, well, he wasn't president yet, but when James Polk was elected president, he made three promises in terms. He made six, but he made three in terms of acquiring land. He said we're going to get Texas, we're going to get Oregon, and we're going to get California. So we got Texas, right? That was accomplished in the last few days of Tyler's administration by joint resolution. Tyler said, well, Polk was elected promising we'd get Texas. So obviously that means that the American people want Texas. So he used that as the pretense to get Congress to pass that joint resolution annexing Texas. We got Oregon, even though Polk had said 54-40 or fight, we split it at the 49th parallel. So we got a good chunk of Oregon, particularly the part where most of the Americans had moved to on the Oregon Trail. So now the third piece of land that Polk promised, that was California. Now, Polk and manifest destiny advocates in general salivated over the idea of getting California. California was seen as almost a magical place on the coast of the Pacific. Would give us access to trade with Asia. Ideas and thoughts that California was a place of riches. Some Americans had already moved there, even though California was part of Mexico at the time. So there was a couple of thousand Americans who were living there. They were called the Californios, like the Texians were the Americans who moved to Texas. The Californios were Americans who moved to Mexican California. Now, how are you going to get California when it belongs to Mexico? Well, President Polk's first idea was to actually purchase California from the Mexican government. But the Mexican government was very angry that the U.S. had annexed Texas because they never recognized Texan independence. And they were claiming that by, excuse me, by annexing Texas, the United States is taking over part of their country. So they were in no mood to sell California to the Americans. When President Polk sent a diplomat there, a man named John Slidell, he sent Slidell there to purchase California from the Mexican government and was willing to pay $25 million for the cost of California. But again, Mexico was so angry about the United States annexing Texas that they refused to even meet with Slidell when he came to talk to them about buying California. Now, just to kind of show you how eager Polk was for a fight, itching for a fight with Mexico, he actually went to Congress and asked Congress to declare war on Mexico because of the disrespect they had shown Slidell by not meeting with him. So that is as flimsy a pretense as you can imagine. So the thing is that it just gives you some idea about how desperate Polk was itching for a fight in order to get California by any means necessary, basically. So he was in a warmongering mood, James Polk. But how do you provoke a war with the Mexicans without the Americans seeming like the aggressors? Well, all came back to Texas. Now, the Mexicans said the border between Texas and Mexico was the Nueces River, which is right here. The Americans said the boundary between Texas and Mexico was the Rio Grande River, which is right here. So that meant this land here is disputed between the Americans and the Mexicans. So if you want to provoke war, usually I ask this question if we were doing this in person, but if you want to provoke a fight with the Mexicans, you would send troops to that disputed area, right? Between the Texans, between the Americans and the Mexicans, right? So we say this is ours, but Mexico said this is theirs. So President Polk sent General Zachary Taylor with a regiment of American troops to that disputed area, just seeing what would happen, hoping, I guess, that not I guess, but clearly hoping that the Mexicans would attack and take the bait. Well, foolishly for the Mexicans, they did take the bait. When General Taylor and his troops were in that disputed area between the Nueces and the Rio Grande River, the Mexicans attacked the U.S. forces, and 16 American soldiers were killed in that confrontation. Now, President Polk then went to Congress again and said, American blood has been shed on American soil. saying that now we have to go to war with Mexico because the Mexican government attacked us, even though it was provoked. But using that pretense, Congress ultimately decided that they would declare war on Mexico based on this. Now, the thing is that both sides were really ready for a fight, the Americans and the Mexicans. But the thing is that this was clearly an aggressive war. Abraham Lincoln, who was a very young congressman, he was serving his one and only term in the U.S. House. He actually called what went down naked aggression. Basically, we provoked this war in order to take land from the Mexicans, and a lot of Whigs, especially Northern Whigs, was solidly opposed to the idea of going to war with Mexico. One, because they thought it was immoral what we were doing. Two, because they thought it was just a plot to expand slavery, that as soon as we get all this new land, then the whole question of slavery would come up again, and the Southerners and Democrats would push to have slavery in any land that we won from Mexico. So the Whig Party was generally opposed to the Mexican War, but particularly the Northern Whigs, who were at the time called the Conscience Whigs, saying that this is not something the United States should be doing. And personally, I think they were absolutely correct. So now we're at war with Mexico. Now, Ulysses Grant, the Union general who won the Civil War and then later became the two-term president of the United States, when he was dying of cancer in 1885, he wrote his memoirs. There's a whole story attached to that. He was swindled out of his money, so in order to leave something to his wife, he decided to write his memoirs. And his memoirs are, I think, the finest presidential memoir ever written. And he's basically focusing mainly on his military career instead of his time as president. And when he was a young man, he had fought in the Mexican War back in the 1840s. So when he was in his 20s, he fought in the Mexican War. So looking back on that experience as a dying man, now in his 60s, he said in his memoirs about the Mexican War, quote, "I was bitterly opposed to that war, and to this day regard it as one of the most unjust ever waged by a stronger nation against a weaker nation. I do not think there was ever a more wicked war than that waged by the United States against Mexico. The wickedness was by our own government, and I'm always ashamed of my country when I think of that invasion." So that's really something, right? This is not like a pacifist, right? He was an aggressive Union general during the Civil War. In fact, he was criticized heavily for his aggressiveness in battle. So that being said, the fact that Grant is actually saying this about the Mexican War is very, very revealing. In 1880, the Republican Party, which was founded 10 years after the Mexican War to oppose the expansion of slavery, looking back on history, so in 1880, I guess the Mexican War had been 35 years earlier. This is what they said about the Mexican War. Quote, "It was one of the darkest scenes in our history, a war forced upon us and the Mexican people by President Polk in pursuit of territorial gain on behalf of the slavocracy." So these were this is what a lot of Americans thought about the Mexican War decades later, that it was basically a shameful episode. We had just provoked this in order to steal Mexico's land. And some Southerners had the motivation of doing it in order to expand slavery. So there's a lot of sinister motivations at work with launching the Mexican War, according to critics. Now, fighting the actual war. Now, California was easily conquered. Mexico was overextended. Mexico actually includes modern day Mexico and also includes the modern day states of California, Nevada, Utah, Colorado, Arizona, and New Mexico. So all that land belonged to Mexico. It was actually part of Mexico when the Mexican War was launched. So they were overextended, the Mexican military and government, which wasn't very strong to begin with, but they were completely overextended. So when we went to California, including not regular regiments of the military, but just kind of like, I won't say soldiers of fortune, but just kind of like a lot of Americans who just kind of swarmed into California as soon as the war started. They easily detached California from Mexico. The battles didn't even last that long. And John C. Fremont, who was one of the soldiers/explorers, the so-called Pathfinder to the West, actually set up a country in California called the Bear Flag Republic. To this day, the bear flag, the bear is on the state flag of California. And very, very briefly, California was an independent country in the way Texas had been in those 9 years before they were annexed into the United States. So the thing is that California is now detached from Mexico. Now, the biggest part of the war was actually going into Mexico itself, well, was now Mexico, and basically attacking their ability to fight us. Now, two great military heroes emerged from the Mexican War. General Zachary Taylor, he was the man who Polk had sent initially to provoke the war in that disputed land in Texas. They nicknamed him Old Rough and Ready because he was a soldier who used to, he never liked wearing military uniform. He wore like farmer's clothes and a straw hat into battle, beloved by his troops. And he defeated Mexican armies despite being heavily outnumbered, sometimes 4 or 5 to 1, and and defeated the Mexican army in most engagements. Taylor actually angered Polk because he agreed to give the Mexicans a 90-day ceasefire. And Polk said, "Why are you doing that? That's just giving them a chance to regroup and fight us more aggressively." So Polk actually took most of Taylor's troops away from him. Even though he now had a diminished army, he then used that smaller army in another battle and defeated the Mexicans despite being even more heavily outnumbered. So that made Zachary Taylor a national hero after that. The other man who emerged from the Mexican War as a military hero was a man named Winfield Scott. Now, Winfield Scott was probably the most acclaimed military hero of the era. He had been in the army since the War of 1812, participated in various Indian battles. Actually, was the one who was in charge of the Trail of Tears, which was, an absolute tragedy. He actually fought the Seminoles down in Florida. And the thing is that he was like the military icon of the era. They nicknamed him Old Fuss and Feathers because he was totally opposite of Taylor. He was very pompous, kind of very impressed with himself, used to wear full military uniform with like epaulets on his shoulders and like the whole deal. So very pompous. Um, and Winfield Scott was the main general in the Mexican War. Now, he planned an invasion of Mexico. And despite a lot of logistical problems, we had to land a lot of troops into Mexico, often by sea. But ultimately, he was able to, go deep into Mexico, ultimately conquering Mexico City, the capital. And by doing that, pretty much overthrew the Mexican government, or at the very least, ended their ability to fight. And that was in late 1847. So the war started in April 1846. So within a year and a half, the Mexican army, for all intents and purposes, had been defeated. Now, a lot of people look at that and say, especially the result of the war, which we're going to talk about in a minute, and say that this was an amazing American victory against the Mexicans. It was a victory, but it did come at an enormous cost. There was a 15% casualty rate among American soldiers in the Mexican War. Um, Casualty means killed or wounded. So the thing is that, well, I'm sorry, let me take that back. Casualties usually does mean killed or wounded, but in the case of the Mexican War, that 15% rate actually is referring to deaths. So 15% of all the American soldiers who fought in the Mexican War were killed. I know what you're thinking. 50%, is that a lot? It is. That's an enormous amount of soldiers. In fact, that's a bigger percentage of soldiers killed in the Mexican War than I think any other war. I don't even think the Civil War had a 15% death rate. So that was enormous. And more American soldiers actually died from disease than actually died from combat. Now, anybody who's ever been to Mexico or anything about traveling to Mexico, one of the big risks that you take when going into Mexico is drinking the water and getting very bad diarrhea. And the diarrhea isn't just like, regular diarrhea. It's like extremely serious dysentery, because there's bacteria in the water in Mexico. And they call it down there Montezuma's revenge, because Montezuma was the Aztec chief who the Spanish overthrew back in the 1500s. And then a lot of the Spanish conquerors wound up dying of this horrible dysentery. So they called it Montezuma's revenge, for having conquered his country and overthrowing him and killing him. Um, So you might think, well, how is this fatal? Montezuma's revenge? It is potentially, because you could wind up losing so many electrolytes by having this horrendous dysentery. And the thing is that that ultimately affects your heart rate and could actually stop your heart from beating. So it's extremely serious. So more soldiers actually died of dysentery and a variety of diseases than actually being killed by Mexican bullets. But still, having a 15% casualty rate in a war is really enormous. Now, let's talk a little bit at the opposition that existed to the war. We talked about that a little bit, but many Northern Whigs were convinced that this war was just being waged on behalf of what they called the slavocracy, meaning the South, the Cotton Kingdom, the South, that wanted to expand slavery into all sorts of new places. And many Northern Whigs were convinced that that was the reason we waged the war. Polk and other supporters of the war said that was not the reason. We just want to conquer land. It's or liberate land or whatever, however they termed it. They were consistent with the ideas of manifest destiny. But that explanation did not convince many Northern Whigs who just believed firmly that this was basically a slave owner's plot in order to expand slavery. Now, it is true, though, that the Mexican War reawakened the whole issue of slavery in the territories. Slavery was always bubbling under the surface as a source of enormous tension between North and South. And a variety of politicians tried anything they could to kind of keep it under the surface. But what the Mexican War did was it was like turning on the heat, right? And when you turn on a heat on a pot of boiling water, eventually, and you leave it on, eventually the water overflows. So the Mexican War was kind of like the heat that was turned on. It had always been contained, the tension, or not always, but had been contained more or less for the past few decades, this tension between North and South. But the Mexican War just caused an enormous amount of pressure, which eventually pops the top off of the cover off the pot. So there would not have been a civil war had there not been a Mexican War, because getting all that land reawakened the whole issue of slavery. I hope that metaphor wasn't impossible to follow with the pot and everything. But that's the way I always see it. In fact, that's a big paper I wrote in college. Like, how was the Mexican War was how is it the cause of the Civil War, and how did it lead to the Civil War? Because if that ever comes up, hint, hint, it's because that it reignited the issue of slavery in the territories, which is ultimately the issue that did cause the break between North and South 15 years later. Now, opponents of slavery in this new land that we could potentially get from Mexico actually wrote a proposed law. Well, it was a bill then. They proposed a bill. This is very important, guys, called the Wilmot Proviso. And the Wilmot Proviso said that slavery would be banned in any territory that we conquered from Mexico. It was passed in 1846 before the war ended, but it was just kind of expecting an American victory. They said that, well, whatever we get from Mexico, that land cannot have slavery. Now, it passed twice in the House of Representatives, the Wilmot Proviso, but it failed in the Senate. Remember, the House is based on population, and there are more Northerners than there are Southerners, so that's why it passed the House. But the Senate, they're equal number. Every state has two and senators, and there was, there was equal number of slave states and free states, so that was an equal number of free state and slave state senators. So it was defeated in the United States Senate, so it never became law. But every northern state legislature endorsed the Wilmot Proviso and actually said, except one, I think New Hampshire did. New Hampshire was always very, very conservative. But that kind of was a foreshadowing of things to come, right? That basically the whole North, including a lot of places that are not abolitionists, David Wilmot himself was not, who wrote the Wilmot Proviso, was not an abolitionist. In fact, was quite racist. And a lot of supporters of the Wilmot Proviso were not abolitionists. So that kind of shows that even non-abolitionist Northerners were supportive of the idea that the land that we get, that new land, should be free of slavery. And later on, this was the fuel for one of the most important movements in American history in the 19th century, the free soil movement. The idea that slavery should not be allowed in the territories largely because it hurt white people's chances of succeeding. Because how could white people compete in this land if they have to compete with slaves who don't have to be paid for their work? So a lot of people like that oppose slavery for those reasons rather than humanitarian reasons. Not that this is because slavery is wrong. It was because they thought it hurt white people. Ralph Waldo Emerson actually said, who is probably the most prominent philosopher of this era in America, he said Mexico will poison us. If we win land from Mexico, you're going to just reignite the whole slavery issue, which is ultimately going to tear North and South apart. And that is a very, very, very apt statement. Emerson was right on most things. John Calhoun, who was probably the most prominent pro-slavery politician in America, he said, quote, Mexico is to us the forbidden fruit. The penalty for eating it will be to subject our institutions to political death. So these were very accurate statements, because you're just tearing off, you're just tearing up the bandage off the wounds by actually going to war at Mexico. Now, remember, General Scott went through Mexico City. He conquered Mexico City, pretty much overthrew the Mexican government, stopping all resistance to the American army. Now, it was pretty much decided that fighting would stop once all the land that we desired had been conquered, or would probably belong to the United States. Now, Polk sent a negotiator, a man named Nicholas Trist, to negotiate a peace agreement with the Mexicans. Now, he wasn't having much luck, so Polk actually told Trist, just come back to Washington. But Trist stayed, and it's lucky he did, I guess, because he ultimately did come up with a peace agreement with Mexico, and that was the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And that treaty gave the United States a breathtaking amount of land. Basically, a third of the entire country of Mexico was taken over by the United States. Again, modern day California, Nevada, Utah, Colorado, Arizona, and New Mexico. So those 6 states were the land that we conquered from Mexico after the Mexican War. It also confirmed U.S. ownership of Texas, because remember, Mexico had been disputing that. That's the whole reason we went to war to begin with. But the United States agreed to pay $15 million for the land that we got, which is interesting because we didn't have to pay anything, right? Because we conquered it in war. But some American sense of fair play saying, well, we at least make it look like we're buying it from them, that we're not just stealing it. So we paid them $15 million, even though it's kind of weird that you're paying after we had won the war. There were some people who actually said, well, we won the war. Why don't we just take over the entire country? Let's take over all of Mexico. Um, and that ardent expansionists, like people who are like hardcore Manifest Destiny people, actually said we should take over all of Mexico. Ultimately, we didn't do that for a number of reasons. But perhaps the biggest was racism. That a lot of the land that we got from Mexico, all those states that we talk about, California, Nevada, Utah, Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico, there were very few Mexicans who actually lived in that land, even though it belonged to Mexico. I think only 7,000 Mexicans actually lived in that land. But Mexico itself, there are millions and millions of Mexicans who speak, another language, who have another religion, who are probably not going to be very receptive to the idea of being conquered by the Americans. And a lot of Americans thought they were, kind of barbaric and primitive, and, we don't want to be responsible for millions of people. So ultimately, the reason we didn't take the whole country was not because we wanted to be nice, but it was because we thought it would just create more problems by actually, conquering the entire country. When the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo came to the United States Senate, it was ratified 38-14. Remember, you need 2/3 to pass the treaty. Conscience Whigs, those northern Whigs who were against the war, tried to kill the treaty unsuccessfully. So once the treaty was ratified, all that land now belonged to the United States. So you could argue that this is an amazing victory for the United States, but the thing is, if you take into account the moral dimensions, the war was basically waged, immorally, even in the words of, as we said, Ulysses Grant. The implications of this war were enormous. A huge amount of land added to the United States. Breathtaking. amount of land, 6 modern day states. Also, a lot of the future military giants of the Civil War actually got their training in the Mexican War, like General Grant, General Lee, who were the northern and southern commanders during the war. They actually, and so many others. We would be here all day, went over all of them. But a lot of the guys who fought in the Mexican War for both in the Civil War for both North and South, first got their taste of fighting and learned how to fight in the Mexican War. Also, and this is also a really big issue, it led to serious strained relations between the United States and Latin America. A lot of Latin Americans believed from this point on that the United States was a bully, right? That we basically picked this war and just stole land from Mexico. It became this feeling in a lot of Latin America that the United States was, even though we kind of thought of ourselves almost as the big brother of Latin America, we're looking after them. But that's not the way a lot of Latin Americans saw it. They saw basically, they called us the Colossus of the North, basically this large country of white Protestants that was always lurking, ready to threaten them and intervene in their business. So it created an enormous amount of strain between the United States and Latin America. But probably the biggest legacy of the Mexican War is opening up the whole issue of slavery in the territories. Was this a slave owners conspiracy? Or getting all this land once we got it, but is it going to have slavery or not? And ultimately, these are the issues that led to the entire 1850s being a time of enormous tension north and south, and of course the 1860s leading to the Civil War. So the getting all that land, the Mexican War, brought up those slavery and the territories issue, which ultimately led to secession and the Civil War in the 1860s. So this is as important as it gets, the Mexican War. All right, guys, very good. So remember, make sure you watch these videos from start to finish. This was a very important video, so I hope you all did that. No skipping through. And I'll see you all in our next live class on Monday. Have a great weekend. Peace.